Dutch freedom fighters and farmers inspired by the Canadian Freedom Convoy movement have just risen up and shocked the world after they won their local elections last week, dealing a major blow to Justin Trudeau's Davos bro, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. What is being described as a political earthquake by international legacy media news outlets, the victory of the Farmer Citizen Movement Party, or the BBB, has no doubt sent a loud message to Justin Trudeau, who, just like his buddy Rutte, has similar plans to introduce crippling emissions reduction legislation on our farmers. The similarities between the two leaders, however, doesn't just stop there. We're going to get into that later on in the show, but the message sent to the WEF-backed ruling elites last week was simple. The time for those who seek to rule every aspect of our lives in the name of saving the planet is over, and the time for freedom-loving patriots who reject those authoritarian policies is right now. Drop a like in the video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, and the comment question for the episode is this: could Justin Trudeau be faced with a similar farmer uprising in this country? Let me know, and let's get into it. The results are in, and the BBB, the Farmer Citizens Movement in the Netherlands, have won 17 seats in the Dutch Senate election. Mark Rutte's coalition government, hell-bent on crippling the lives of Dutch farmers and enacting emissions reduction targets in the name of saving the planet, was dealt a decisive defeat. Now, this is how Reuters just reported on the political earthquake in the Netherlands. Dutch Farmers Protest Party scores big election win, shaking up Senate. A farmers' protest party shook up the political landscape in the Netherlands on Wednesday, emerging as the big winner in provincial elections that determined the makeup of the Senate. The BBB, or Farmer Citizen Movement Party, rode a wave of protests against the government's environmental policies and looks set to have won more Senate seats than Prime Minister Mark Rutte's conservative VVD party. Conservative. I love that. If anyone knows anything about Mark Rutte, conservative is the last adjective they would use to describe Mark Rutte's governing style. The meteoric rise of BBB is a major blow for Rutte's governing coalition, casting doubt over its aim to drastically cut nitrogen pollution on farms, the single issue upon which the BBB was founded in 2019. Rutte's government has not had a Senate majority since the previous provincial elections in 2019 and must negotiate deals with mostly left-wing opponents. The two most cooperative parties, Labour and Green Left, looked set to have held on to their seats, keeping their combined groups at a par with BBB and possibly enough to maintain support for Rutte's policies. Rutte's government, in its fourth consecutive term since 2010, has dropped to a 20% approval rating, its lowest in a decade. Plummeting approval ratings? Having to sign deals with far-left parties just to stay in power? Doesn't that sound familiar to you guys? Even though international legacy media news outlets have been covering the shock political victory of the BBB, don't worry, they haven't changed too much. The BBC, who can always be counted on to push biased, skewed, and narrative-promoting news, have tried to discredit the farmers' protest movement as a fringe idea that uses fear to gain electoral results. Just listen to the palpable frustration coming from the mouth of this BBC journalist who has to describe the political victory of the BBB.
Let's get more on this. I'm joined by our correspondent in The Hague, Anna Holligan. Anna, welcome to you. So tell us more about who this party is, what they represent.
They didn't exist 4 years ago. That's how remarkable this earthquake in Dutch politics really is. The big question now is, though, will this farmers' party that was built on a foundation of fear among farmers that their farms, their dairy farms, are going to be bought out under government plans to try to reduce harmful nitrogen pollution in order to meet climate targets, will this party actually be able to live up to that promise by blocking the government's plans in the Senate? Because it looks set to become the largest party. And yet, on the other side of the political spectrum, on the left, the Greens and Labour are teaming up to form an alliance, which will probably get the same number of seats, 15 seats in the Senate.
Did you catch what she said there? That the Farmer Citizens Movement Party was built around fear that farmers had that their farms would be seized by the Dutch government? That BBC journalist conveniently forgot to mention that the fear that Dutch farmers have when it comes to their government is not unfounded. In fact, it is the express public goal of Mark Rutte to seize farms from Dutch farmers who aren't going to abide by his ridiculous emissions reduction schemes. Last year, in the wake of the Freedom Convoy, Dutch farmers rose up against their government for declaring that nitrogen emissions would be reduced by 50% by 2030. How exactly did the Dutch government plan to achieve their lofty reduction targets? Well, this is how The Guardian put it last year. 2,000 to 3,000 peak polluters, as the government describes them, who are, quote, mostly farmers, an agriculture minister spokesperson told The Guardian, will be offered a final set of choices. Innovate to drastically reduce emissions, transition to a new kind of business, extend in ways that reduce their impact, relocate, or voluntarily stop. And if these multi-generational Dutch farmers choose to not voluntarily stop their way of life, well, the government has openly said that they will just simply force the buyouts of farms. They will nationalize and expropriate farmland in order to achieve their climate goals. Isn't there a history lesson somewhere about what happens to people when their government seizes farmlands for political purposes? I don't know, sounds kind of familiar. Oh, and along with the Dutch government's plan to seize the farmland of, quote, peak polluters, it also includes plans to get rid of millions of cattle and pigs. And after the Dutch government made that announcement, Dutch farmers rose up last year in historic numbers, taking a page out of the Freedom Convoy movement and showing their defiance to Mark Rutte's authoritarian climate policies. Those protests resulted in the resignation of the Dutch agricultural minister and, thanks to the results last week, the defeat of the Dutch government in the Senate elections. Now, thanks to some great reporting from True North and other outlets, we know that Justin Trudeau plans to implement similar emissions reduction targets on Canadians. But True North's exclusive reporting, the fertilizer files from Cosman, Georgia, show just how close Justin Trudeau's climate policies are aligned with Mark Rutte's. In fact, the Canadian Agricultural Minister, Marie-Claude Bibeau, has openly said that the Canadian government takes inspiration from Mark Rutte's authoritarian farming policies. Through access to information requests, True North was able to obtain internal Agriculture Canada documents, and from that, take a look at what we were able to find. A copy of a speech delivered by Agriculture Minister Marie-Claude Bibeau that same year as part of a sustainable agriculture webinar with European counterparts went even further, describing Canada's measure as, quote, very closely aligned with fertilizer reduction targets in the EU's farm-to-fork strategy. And given that fertilizer accounts for a large chunk of agricultural emissions, you might think that advising the fertilizer industry in Canada might be a wise choice before implementing these targets, especially how Dutch farmers reacted to similar targets being placed on them. But who could have guessed? The Canadian government didn't have time to advise the fertilizer industry. They didn't have time to advise farmers whose lives would be upended by these emissions reduction targets. They just had to do it anyway. Because in the name of climate, as we all know, you have to control the farmers. You have to control the food supply. Daniel Kelter, the senior manager of government relations for Fertilizer Canada, went on to explain in an email to True North that the fertilizer industry was not consulted on the 30% emission reduction goal, even though we have been actively working in this field for the last 10 years and had asked Agriculture Canada for cooperation on this exact issue a number of times. Fertilizer Canada wrote a public report to Canadians warning them that if this emissions reduction target went ahead, farmers could stand to lose billions of dollars in the name of fighting climate change. The situation in the Netherlands and the situation in Canada are too similar not to mention. You have two unpopular young global leaders in Mark Rutte and Justin Trudeau, both hell-bent on saving the planet through crippling emissions reduction targets and other ridiculous climate goals, desperately holding on to power by signing agreements with far-left parties, both facing huge protest movements. So why hasn't this happened in Canada? Could a similar single-issue party win a provincial or even a federal election, take some seats in the House of Commons? All we've seen so far in Canada are small-scale, unsuccessful, amateur imitations of what the farmer citizen movement has become in the Netherlands. But given the similarities of our countries and our prime ministers, you'd be kidding yourself if you didn't think that Justin Trudeau wasn't looking at this result and getting a little nervous. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for us today on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratio.